Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Clinical Pharmacist podcast. Today, we've got a fantastic guest with us. We've got Siddiqur, who is a general practice-based pharmacist, prescriber based in Kent, who's worked in the GP sector for over 7 years, who's also worked in the community pharmacy sector for a decade as well. So Siddiqur is a lead diabetes clinician at the practice and also a PDA union rep for primary care in the Southeast region, as well as a co-director for the Pharmacist Cooperative, which helps to support, train and network with pharmacists around the UK. Siddiqur also works for the local PCN as a community education facilitation lead to help train and upskill clinicians in primary care networks with the local training hub. So welcome, Siddiqur. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So Siddiqur is joining us as a pharmacist representing his own views. Although he is a pharmacist who is a PDA rep, his views today are his own, and he is not representing PDA. And we've also got my colleague and co-host today, Ruhina Kassam, who is the Clinical Services Manager for Clinical Pharmacist Solutions. Welcome to you as well, Ruhina.
Hi, Rina. Hi, Siddiqur. Lovely to have you with us today, Siddiqur.
So today we've got, I think, a very important subject to discuss. It's about pharmacists' competencies and gathering evidence of competencies. So I think it's a hot topic at the moment. We've seen some pharmacists get in trouble, unfortunately, where the CQC inspectors and GPhC regulators are stepping in. So I think pharmacists are in need of guidance. Hopefully with your expertise, Siddiqur and Ruhina, your experience as well, and some of my experience as well, we can provide our audience some advice and information on how to go about understanding your competencies and how to gather evidence of competency. So Siddiqur, if I can start off this question asking you, why is it important for pharmacists working in general practice to have evidence of competency?
For a lot of the pharmacists working in general practice, who will be the first time working in this sector. They're not necessarily will not have been talking about this sector during the pharmacy undergraduate course as well. Although the clinical knowledge will be taught, I think there's quite a wide variety of activities that pharmacists undertake in the general practice sector, such as clinical audits, NMH drug alerts, high-risk drug monitoring. I know you guys did a great podcast last time around about the difference between a pharmacist prescriber and a non-prescriber working in general practices. And there's quite a lot of activities where you don't need to utilize your prescribing qualification into the general practice sector. Now, how do you know that you're competent and say what you what knowledge that makes you applicable working in general practice? Because when PCNs or general practices recruit a pharmacist, most of them would not have worked with their pharmacist in the general practice sector before, so they wouldn't know in terms of what will be the strengths and weaknesses working in general practice. And for me, as a clinician, there's nothing more dangerous than someone who is unconsciously incompetent, i.e. they don't know what they don't know. And I think as a pharmacist and as a professional, it's your duty to be vigilant and to be aware of your limitations and your competence. And where there are any knowledge gaps, you're not expected to know everything there is to know about general practice and every single clinical disease available. But what you are supposed to know is, who do you turn to? Who do you signpost? Or who do you refer to? Patient starts deteriorating. So again, it's not just about covering your own backsides, it's also patient safety at risk here as well. So what do you know about the various levels, what kind of activities you can do and you can't do? But at the same time, you don't want to just limit yourself to working one specific clinical area, because again, you're not making yourself marketable for that particular general practice or primary care network. So if you have that discussion early on with PCNs or general practice to say, yes, I'm able to do this particular activity, but I'm not competent enough to do the other activity that you want me to do. But if with the right support and guidance, I can hopefully be able to do that for you. So it just it works both ways. Like as long as pharmacists are aware with the main contents and limitations as well. That's a good start.
Ruhina, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I think, no, I completely agree, Siddiqur. And I think now with pharmacists changing sectors as well, we can't always just assume that a competency in one sector is going to reflect the same in another sector. So coming in from general practice, maybe doing an asthma review and checking inhaler technique is going to be slightly different when you're coming into general practice and you've got tools such as the in-check dial, measuring peak flows, all available for you. So it's really important that you are increasing that level of competency depending on what sector that you're in and just building upon that as well. So leading into my next question, Siddiqur, for our pharmacists, what does building up evidences of competencies look like?
So for those who are already aware, I was a PDA rep as well. They have produced a fantastic frequently asked questions document for those pharmacists working in general practice, regardless if you're a prescriber or non-prescriber. And they've given some useful tips into the different types of activities that you can gain evidence of competence. So one such thing is you get some formal qualifications in a specific disease area, for example. Obviously, the highest level of qualification will be something that is being accredited by a university as well. There are study days and online courses as well that you guys can attend. In terms of courses and identify any knowledge gaps to upskill yourself, obviously, if you are able to get that funded, either through your employer, your general practice, or from the local training hub, and then that's great. That'll be first foremost. But if you're unable to get funded and you think that it's really beneficial for you, there's no shame in for you to pay for this course yourself. So, for example, when I first worked in general practices, I was locuming for the best part of the decade, and it came to a point where I wanted to actually utilize my clinical knowledge more for my patients, and I also wanted to become a prescriber as well. So this was about 8 years ago, so where it wasn't really common for pharmacists working in general practices. And I've seen an advertisement in Chemist and Druggist where there was a couple of pharmacists already working in general practices offering a course. And this was about the day-to-day role of what they do in their typical general practice day. And that course cost about £750. And then there's another £750 to shadow them for about 2-3 days as well, if you wanted to find out more about that role. So for me, in total, £1,500, I'll pay that out of my pocket. And for me, I feel it's like the best money I've ever spent, because literally a few months down the line, that's when NHS England have announced that they were going to fund a pilot for the GP Pharmacists pilot scheme. And because of the course that I attended and the connection that I built up with the trainers, they've selected me to be a part of one of the first 450 pharmacists in the country to be part of the GP Pharmacists pilot scheme. So again, in any walks of life, in any professional, if you wanted to upskill yourself, money won't be wasted if you wanted to upskill and gain further qualification, experience, and exposure, because it's money that you're investing in for yourself and for your future and career. The other evidences that you can do would be some self-directed study with your players as well. And I think it's important in general practice because it can be quite isolating. So if you have like-minded pharmacists working in the same sector as you, regardless of where you are in the country, getting that feedback from each other is a valuable tool and help as well. If you're shadowing as well with other clinicians as well, and it's pretty easy to do in a general practice setting because there's other clinicians as well. You can get some supervised practice and make documentation and keep a portfolio as well. And that, again, will satisfy both the CQC inspection, your CPD revalidation as well. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I've kept a folder since I started general practice 7 years ago. All the various certificates, training attendance, course qualifications, appraisals, commentaries, countersigned by relevant clinicians. And these form part of my portfolio of evidence, which hopefully will satisfy my competence and scope of practice.
Okay, that's fantastic, Siddiqur. And thank you so much for showing us your folder and the size of it as well. Because I think, speaking from experience, we've had pharmacists reaching out to us, Clinical Pharmacy Solutions, where they're in primary care and suddenly their practice is having a CQC inspection and they're scrambling in the last minute and they're asking us for advice, or they're asking us for some of the certificates that for the courses that they've undertaken with us in the past. And I think it's really important, as you've demonstrated as well, and you've done, to collect your competencies as you go along, because if you leave it to the last minute, you might forget, and you may not be able to get some of your certificates. And touching upon that as well with regards to the type of competencies, adding to what you said as well. So the PDA guidance document has suggested that in terms of the type of competencies, it's not just workshops or courses that you attend, but it's also having that environment where you may have a senior clinicians overseeing your work, that they're able to review your work, supervise you and give you feedback. Also having a peer group to ask questions and just bounce ideas back and forth. So yeah, I think working within a supportive team is very important. And you rightly said, Siddiqur, at the start is, some pharmacists, especially if you're brand new to the role, you don't know what you don't know. And I think if you are brand new to the role and you're going into a practice, let's say you're going into a GP practice and you may be the only pharmacist there, and you don't know where to start, and perhaps the GP surgery had a pharmacist prior to you who was running minor illness clinics, and they're a prescriber. They may have the same expectation of you, and they may be asking you to do things that are well above your competency level. But because you don't have that support system around you, and you're the only pharmacist there, and it's your first role, you're brand new to the sector, you don't know whether it's appropriate for you to take on these roles because you don't want to look like you don't know anything, and you'll be under a lot of pressure. So I think it's really important to try and seek out that peer network group. Make sure you're in touch with some senior clinicians, develop really good relationships with the GPs there, or some of the advanced clinicians, whether it's a nurse or anyone else. So yeah, that was just sort of my 2 cents that I wanted to add in. Oh, back to you, Siddiqur, go ahead.
Just to follow on what we were saying there, is if you're making connections as well, it's good to be proactive as well. So don't just limited to within your own general practice or primary care network. Reach out to other pharmacists, across social media networks as well, and locally. The pharmacist that helped me when I started in general practice was my local CCG mental management team, because they've been working in general practice years before me, and they've got quite good connections, and they also speak to your general practices in terms of managing your expectations. And you obviously no 2 pharmacists are the same, and you can't be expected to seamlessly work one practice to another and doing the exact same things, because everyone has different requirements or different needs, and again, surgeries can't be expecting every pharmacist to work exactly the same, because everyone has different interests or different skill sets, which can complement in some practice, may not in other practice. So just raising awareness as well, it's quite good.
Absolutely. And I think it's fantastic to see your portfolio there, Siddiqur. I think that's like a highlight for all pharmacists, that we should be looking to kind of achieve a portfolio like that. And I think given your expertise and your progression so far as pharmacists with everything that you've done, I think it's great to see like your portfolio there. So thank you for sharing that with us as well. And just agreeing as well with what you've touched on. So it doesn't have to be like certified courses as well, but actually shadowing GPs, shadowing senior pharmacists that have got competency in these areas, building up that kind of skill set that you're trying to develop in a particular area, that can also help you to build up the competencies as well. And keeping notes of those, like keeping a log, saying that I've shadowed X amount of consultations, I've done this under supervision, I now have read the guidelines, this nice guideline, or any additional guidelines and journals that you may have looked into. So I think all these little things as well can help to build up your competencies. It's just about making sure you're documenting them and keeping record of them to help build up such a great portfolio as well. So going on to our next question, Siddiqur, what are your top 3 tips for pharmacists on building up their portfolio of competencies?
For my first tip, what I would recommend for pharmacists working in general practice is to start doing the portfolios from the get-go, because again, you don't want to be working lastminute.com when you CQCs which should come in, because as you get more time, experience and exposure in general practices, you'll be seeing a lot of things, and you'll be wanting to document and write down any commentaries as well. And what I do as well is to complete a boundaries of clinical practice statement, which the PDA have published on their website. You don't need to have, say, for example, renewing your indemnity, but it's good to have that alongside with you when you are doing any type of formal training, or some of the activities I mentioned earlier about self-directed study, clinical supervision, mentoring as well. And in that document, it does recommend to say, if there's an element where it's beyond guidelines or within your competency, who do you turn to? Who do you refer to? So as long as you have that network system going as well, then that's a good start. In addition to that, as a prescriber myself, my CCG, again, it might be different to other areas of the country. They want a specific prescribing scope of practice for those who are non-medical prescribers. And the way I do them is I do them in order of BNF clinical chapters. So I document any type of relevant training regarding that clinical disease area that I've done, and get that countersigned by my GP clinical supervisor or senior clinical pharmacist as well. So for my second tip, what I recommend is to share the training days that you do attend with your clinical peers as well. And I think there's an expectation for practices to have a certain amount of clinical meetings as well. So if you do attend any study days or training days, it's good for you yourself as the pharmacist to take the lead, or apply that learning into practice and showcase that to other clinicians as well, which I'm more than certain that they would appreciate as well. And this will hopefully also build on any case studies relevant to that clinical disease areas that you can share and bounce ideas as well. And again, if you minute the clinical meetings, that can again form as part of evidence for your portfolio of competence. And my final tip that I'll recommend is documentation, and in that order. Why? Because I think as pharmacists, especially if we're working from a community pharmacy setting, we're not great at documenting and recording notes compared to community pharmacy. In terms of documentation, it's important not just in terms of covering your own background as a pharmacist, but also from a patient safety aspect as well. And one of the key things when it comes to documentation is safety netting, and knowing when to signpost patients if they're in worsening or deteriorating of the conditions. For example, as a diabetic, how would they know if they're going to get a low blood glucose level, or if the other way around, if the sugar levels are getting high? When do they need to check their ketone levels in order to prevent diabetic ketoacidosis? When do they need to be referred or blue lighted to A&E? And it's something as a pharmacist you should be aware of yourself anyway, because it's not just about the medication. You also need to know the potential red flags and the potential other differential diagnosis as well. Once you have that knowledge in mind, then you can safely document as to if the patient's condition is deteriorating, who would you signpost and who would you refer to, or for the patient themselves, what do they need to do in order to make sure that the condition isn't going to worsen or they're going to require an A&E or emergency appointment. In addition to the documentation, the phrase is, if it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. And I think that's more important than ever before. So in the general practice setting, we'll be seeing a lot of patients and be documenting what things that you have done, and just as importantly, if not more, things that you haven't done or you haven't prescribed. So this is something that we don't tend to do in the community pharmacy setting. And it's important that any interaction that you have with the patient, that everything gets documented and recorded, as well as what is your potential plan of action as well. So that if another clinician is looking at that patient, they'll have an idea as to what was the purpose of your consultation with that patient and how they would like to proceed in terms of the next steps.
Yeah, thank you, Siddiqur Rahman. Very fantastic and practical tips that you shared that hopefully our listeners could take away and implement in their practice. And, just with regards to the emphasis that you put on the importance of documentation and safety netting, I'm sure Ruhina would agree with me that, it's something that we try and educate our internal pharmacists about a lot. I think only probably just 2 weeks ago, we ran an internal training session for our pharmacists, particularly on this subject of safety netting and documentation. As you said, if it's not written and it's not documented, then you can't prove that it happened. So yeah, very good tips. Ruhina, any comments from you?
No, so I completely agree there. I think as we do notes reviews, peer-to-peer reviews, we often pick up that documentation and safety netting are one of the areas where pharmacists really lack in their consultation notes. So I completely agree and reiterate, we really try to put that into all of our pharmacists. And we, as Ruhina said, recently ran a lunch and learn session to try and help everyone to kind of expand that area of their consultation notes. So I think really useful tips, Siddiqur.
Okay.
So I think we've covered quite a few points that hopefully our listeners can take away. And just a couple of things that I'd like to reiterate to our pharmacists listening in to this podcast is, I know we spoke a lot about CQC inspectors and GPhC regulators, and some pharmacists are actually being, referred to GPhC regulators, because of the lack of sufficient competency demonstrated when the CQC inspectors reviewed their work. So I hope, this is more sort of like a wake-up call for our pharmacists, and I hope it doesn't turn into, sort of like scare tactics for some of those pharmacists who are either new to the sector or are hoping to transition into this sector. I think it's important, as you both mentioned, it's important for pharmacists to take responsibility for their learning. And where, although pharmacists have been in general practice for a little while now, it's still fairly new. And, a lot of the areas that pharmacists are able to practice in, it's not necessarily clear cut. Between a prescriber and a non-prescriber, it may be where, as a prescriber, you may be able to initiate new medication and, diagnose a patient with a new condition. However, there is, a lot of grey areas and some overlap as well. So I think it's important to, first of all, understand the sector properly. And as you said, experience in one sector, so in the community pharmacy sector, just because someone may have 15, 20 years of experience in a community setting or a hospital setting, and then may have been a fantastic pharmacist in that setting, it can't be assumed that they have that same level of competency when they come into a brand new sector like the general practice or primary care sector. It's a completely different ballgame. There's different competencies, different knowledge and skill set required. And speaking from experience as well, that I remember I had an interview once with a pharmacist who was a fantastic hospital pharmacist. She used to work autonomously, running all sorts of clinics and being a lead for the hospital pharmacy team. However, when it came to the interview for a general practice role, it was clear that, she did have knowledge gaps. So I think it's important for you to recognize that, to understand that you are going to need to upskill yourself, whether it's, getting funded training or putting the investments in and upskilling yourself. And I think one of the things that, we've developed as an organization is a pharmacist self-assessment tool. This is an assessment tool that takes less than 5 minutes to complete. It's available for free for all pharmacists in the UK to take. So to date, more than 4,000 pharmacists have taken this self-assessment. And it's basically a tool designed to ask you questions to identify which competency level you're at. So generally speaking, in primary care, there are about 4 or 5 levels of pharmacists in primary care. The first level being someone who, knows how to use the system. When they enter the sector for the first time, they may do things like audits, similar to what a technician might do. Then you have the next level where a pharmacist is able to do reauthorizations and perhaps some medication reviews. And then the third level is a pharmacist who is able to run, perhaps some chronic condition reviews, structured medication reviews. And then moving on from that, you have level 4. This is someone who's has an independent prescribing qualification and might be running clinics such as minor illness clinics where diagnosis and prescribing new medication is involved. And then you've got level 5, which is what we call senior or lead pharmacist. This is more someone who's involved in managing a pharmacist team. They might be involved in policy development, and leading on projects like that. So I think, it's important for pharmacists to understand that pharmacists do vary greatly in their abilities. And then when you do enter this sector, there are a variety of roles that can be undertaken. So I would encourage everyone, if they haven't done so already, and they are wondering what level they're at, to take this self-assessment. It's called Pharmacist Self-Assessment.org.uk. Hopefully it will enable you to identify your knowledge gaps so that you can practice within your competency scope, and also give you an idea of what areas you can develop into so you have a developmental pathway for career progression. So I think we've spoken enough about the subject, and we've touched upon some really important aspects. So lastly, Siddiqur, just before we close, how can other pharmacists contact or network with you?
With me, I've written various different types of articles and pieces about pharmacists working in general practice with different topics. So I think the best way for them to get in touch with me is through various social media networks like LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and my handle is at GP Pharmacist, as I'm readily available for people to network as well.
Great, thank you so much. Again, thank you, Siddiqur, for joining us. You've shared some valuable information, and thank you, Ruhina, as well, for being with me again today.
Thank you both. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.